The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a blood-red dawn, its waves whispering secrets of the war to come. In 1942, the world was burning, Europe in ruins, Asia devoured by imperial ambition. But in the Pacific, the war had only just begun to roar. After Pearl Harbor, America had bled and burned, and its men were hungry for retribution. Across the map of the world, one name began to echo among the restless ranks of the U.S. Marines: Carlson's Raiders. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were volunteers forged from rebellion and conviction, drawn by a man who believed war could be fought differently. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson was no stranger to the brutality of empire. He had seen the Japanese war machine in China, watched villages burn under rising suns, and learned that victory would demand more than firepower. It would demand spirit. He called it gung-ho, work together. That became their creed. In the summer of 1942, in a hidden base on the island of Oahu, Carlson and his men prepared for an operation so secret it was known only to a handful of officers. Their mission: to strike deep into Japanese-held territory, to land on a tiny speck of coral called Makin Atoll, and to hit the enemy where they least expected it. It was to be a message: America was not defeated. The raiders trained under brutal heat. They marched through mud, crawled under live fire, learned to kill in silence. They rehearsed amphibious landings again and again until exhaustion blurred into instinct. Their faces were lean, their bodies raw from sun and sweat, their eyes hard with anticipation. Among them were men from farms, cities, and broken homes, each carrying their own ghosts from Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines. As August drew near, whispers rippled through the ranks. Something was coming. On the evening of August 8th, the raiders boarded two submarines, USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut. The steel beasts slipped into the Pacific depths, their decks closing like coffins over the men inside. The air was hot and stale, laced with diesel and fear. The hum of the engines was constant, a reminder that they were now cut off from the world above. Inside the cramped metal belly, Carlson briefed his men. A small map spread across the table showed their target, Makin Atoll, part of the Gilbert Islands, occupied by a Japanese garrison of about 80 men. Their mission: destroy the enemy base, capture intelligence, and sow confusion about where the next blow would fall. It was a psychological strike as much as a military one. The raiders listened in silence. They understood the risk. Submarines were not designed to carry assault troops or rubber boats, yet here they were, preparing for a night landing hundreds of miles from help. If things went wrong, no one was coming to save them. As Nautilus and Argonaut closed in on Makin's dark silhouette, rain lashed the sea. The tropical storm that brewed that night would become both ally and enemy. The surf was violent, tossing their rubber boats like toys. The engines sputtered, oars broke. Men were thrown into the water, weapons lost to the waves, yet through the chaos the raiders pressed on. The island drew nearer, low ring of palms and sand against the lightning-flashed horizon. Just before dawn on August 17, 1942, the first raiders touched Makin's beach. They moved silently, weapons clutched, uniforms soaked, hearts pounding. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. They could hear the faint sounds of Japanese voices somewhere beyond the trees. Carlson signaled the advance. Two groups, one led by himself, the other by Captain James Roosevelt, son of the president, would sweep through the island, converge on the Japanese positions, and eliminate resistance. For hours they crawled through jungle and swamp until the first shots cracked through the humid air. The Battle of Makin had begun. The first Japanese sentries fell quickly, but the alarms spread. From bunkers and huts came shouts and return fire. The The raiders moved fast, their automatic rifles cutting through palm fronds and shadows. Grenades exploded against wooden defenses. The sound of war shattered the island's morning silence. Marine Sergeant Clyde Thomason, leading a squad on the right flank, was among the first to charge forward under heavy fire. Bullets ripped the leaves around him. He rallied his men, shouting above the chaos, and returned fire until a burst struck him down. He would later become the first Marine raider to receive the Medal of Honor, posthumously. By mid-morning, smoke hung over Makin. Carlson's raiders had taken control of much of the island, but the Japanese fought fiercely from their remaining strongpoints. Every palm grove, every sand dune hid danger. The heat was suffocating, the stench of burning fuel and cordite filling their lungs. The radio crackled with half-heard orders drowned by static. Carlson's men tried to coordinate a withdrawal to the submarines, but the sea had turned against them again. The surf pounded the shore with relentless fury, making extraction impossible. As the raiders gathered their wounded and counted their ammunition, the reality set in. They might be stranded. Carlson refused to panic. He gathered his officers beneath a shattered palm and outlined a new plan. They would dig in, repel any counterattack, and wait for the seas to calm. As night fell, the raiders held their positions, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The distant horizon flickered with the glow of burning huts, the island of Makin consumed by war's fire. Above them, the stars burned bright, indifferent to the suffering below. For the men of Carlson's raiders, the mission was far from over. They had struck the enemy, but now they would have to survive him. The sun rose over Makin in a blaze of red and gold, turning the horizon into a furnace. For the men of Carlson's raiders, it wasn't dawn, it was a warning. Smoke hung in the air, drifting over the palms like a shroud. The once serene lagoon now reeked of blood, oil, and salt. The night's silence broke under the distant crack of Japanese rifles and the low hum of enemy reinforcements stirring in the jungle. Lieutenant Colonel Carlson knelt in the sand beside his map, the morning humidity already soaking through his fatigues. Around him, exhausted raiders crouched, their faces streaked with grime and disbelief. What had begun as a swift hit-and-run raid had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The Japanese had regrouped faster than anyone expected. Their numbers were greater, their determination fierce. This wasn't a remote outpost, it was a hornet's nest. Carlson's voice cut through the morning haze. "We hit them again. Hard. No hesitation." His eyes scanned the men, some young enough to still look like boys, others hardened by previous campaigns. Captain James Roosevelt nodded silently beside him, the president's son now deep in the same mud and terror as everyone else. There was no rank in that jungle, only survival. The raiders advanced through dense foliage where visibility shrank to a few feet. Every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline surging. Japanese machine guns barked from concealed nests, ripping apart branches and sending splinters through the air. The Marines answered with bursts from their Thompsons and bars, muzzle flashes illuminating their grim faces. The battle wasn't fought in sweeping maneuvers, it was personal, close, and suffocating. Sergeant Clyde Thomason's squad moved through a thicket toward a Japanese radio hut. He was already wounded but refused to fall back. He hurled a grenade through a bamboo window. The explosion tore the hut apart, shattering the stillness with a roar. Moments later, he was struck by enemy fire while dragging a wounded man to safety. His body collapsed into the sand, lifeless but defiant. His courage became legend among the raiders who witnessed it. Further inland, Carlson's second group came under mortar fire. The earth trembled with every explosion, sending showers of sand and palm fronds into the air. Men ducked behind roots and logs as shrapnel tore through the jungle. Corporal Joe Mendez felt the heat of a blast scorch his back as he pressed his face into the mud. "Stay low!" came the shout, but orders barely mattered now. Instinct ruled everything. By midday, the raiders pushed deeper into the Japanese perimeter. They found trenches hastily dug and bodies strewn among them. The Japanese fought to the last man. No surrender, no retreat. When their ammunition ran out, they charged with bayonets and grenades clutched to their chests, turning themselves into living weapons. The Marines met them with cold precision, their movements honed by training and desperation. The air filled with screams, gunfire, and the dull thud of grenades. One raider described it later as hell in a 100-yard circle. From the lagoon came another sound, a rising mechanical whine that froze the men in place. Carlson lifted his binoculars toward the horizon. Out beyond the coral reef, dark shapes emerged against the blue glare of the sea. 2 Japanese seaplanes circled, followed by the faint outline of enemy vessels moving closer. The Japanese Navy had been alerted. The hunters were now the hunted. Carlson's radio operator tried to reach the Nautilus. Static, garbled words, and silence. The jungle seemed to close in around them. For a moment, Carlson looked across the beach and thought of the impossible irony. They had come to sow confusion, but now they were the ones lost, stranded between sea and enemy fire. As the sun reached its zenith, the heat became suffocating. Sweat mingled with blood, turning the raiders' uniforms into crusted armor. They scavenged canteens from the fallen, their throats dry as sandpaper. And still the Japanese attacked. Snipers hidden in the palms, voices shouting in Japanese through the foliage, eerie and taunting. In one brutal engagement near the lagoon, a squad of raiders found themselves surrounded. Machine gun fire pinned them against a sand embankment. Private Harry Lippman, bleeding from his shoulder, grabbed a rifle from a fallen comrade and climbed the mound, firing down at the attackers until he was hit again and fell backward, dead before he touched the ground. His sacrifice allowed the rest of his squad to break free. Carlson moved between the groups, his voice steady, his presence like a rock amid chaos. "Keep moving! Don't let them box you in!" He called in mortar support from his own men, the shells arching high and falling among the Japanese lines. The concussions shook the earth, sending fire and smoke rising in columns. By late afternoon, the raiders had destroyed the Japanese radio station, fuel dumps and supply stores, exactly as ordered. Flames consumed the outpost, black smoke rising like a beacon over the Pacific. But it was a victory bought with blood. Nearly 20 Marines lay dead, and many more were wounded. When the time came to withdraw, the sea betrayed them again. The surf on Makin's beaches had turned violent under shifting tides. Rubber boats were capsized and torn apart. Men fought to push them through crashing waves while bullets whipped across the water. One boat flipped, throwing its crew into the current. Some were rescued, others vanished beneath the foam. Carlson realized the impossible truth: they could not leave. The submarines waiting offshore could not risk coming closer under Japanese air patrols. For the moment, the raiders were trapped. They dug in for the night, setting perimeter guards, patching wounds with field dressings, conserving the last of their ammunition. The night that followed was surreal. The jungle buzzed with insects and the faint moans of the wounded. In the distance, Japanese soldiers shouted commands and dragged away their dead. Occasionally, a shot rang out from the darkness, answered by the crack of a Marine rifle. Somewhere in the shadows, Corporal Robert Dean wrote in his small notebook by the dim light of a match, "The world feels very small tonight. Just us, this island, and the enemy, nothing else." Carlson gathered his officers beneath the wreckage of a palm. He outlined a plan to attempt evacuation at dawn, using whatever boats they could salvage. He knew that every minute they stayed increased the chance of annihilation. The Japanese would not allow them to leave without blood. As the hours dragged toward morning, the men drifted between exhaustion and alertness. Each sound, each rustling leaf could mean death. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then torrential. It washed the blood from their faces, cooled their fevered skin, and filled the foxholes with muddy water. Yet the storm also brought concealment, hiding their movements from the Japanese. Just before dawn, Carlson gave the order. "We move now. Get to the beach." The raiders emerged from the jungle, ghosts in the dim grey light, carrying their wounded on makeshift stretchers. The surf still raged, but they had no choice. Men pushed the boats into the waves, some praying, others silent. Machine gun fire erupted from the tree line, tracers slicing through the mist. A bullet struck the water inches from Captain Roosevelt's leg as he heaved a wounded Marine into a raft. The boats lurched forward, engines sputtering, paddles thrashing. Some made it past the breakers, others overturned. From the Nautilus, lookouts watched through periscopes as figures fought against the tide, mere silhouettes in the storm. Carlson's voice finally crackled over the radio, hoarse but clear. Request extraction support. Raiders still engaged. The submarine's crew scrambled to prepare covering fire. Deck guns opened up, shells screaming over the lagoon to pound the Japanese positions. The thunderous explosions echoed off the coral walls, sending enemy troops scattering. The raiders, soaked and half-drowned, clung to their boats, driven by the single instinct to survive. When Carlson himself was the last to leave the shore, he turned back one final time. The island was burning, Japanese flags falling, huts collapsing under smoke. Dozens of his men still waited inland, unable to reach the extraction point. He clenched his jaw, rage and guilt twisting inside him. "We'll come back for them," he said, though he knew the promise might be impossible. As Nautilus and Argonaut submerged, carrying the survivors away into the depths, the glow of Makin faded behind them. The sea closed over their wake, erasing the battle's scars but not its memory. Inside the submarine, the silence was heavy. Men sat dripping and shivering in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of those left behind. The Makin Raid had struck the enemy, but it had also left wounds that would never fully heal. And in the waters they had just escaped, Japanese forces were already regrouping, their vengeance rising like the tide. The submarines slipped beneath the surface, leaving the black silhouette of Makin Atoll behind, a burning scar in the middle of the Pacific. Inside the Nautilus, the air was thick with exhaustion, sweat, and silence. The surviving raiders sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces hollow, uniforms clinging to their skin. Salt water and blood mixed in the bilges. The mission that was meant to be swift and precise had turned into a struggle against the elements, the enemy, and fate itself. Carlson sat alone near the aft compartment, his journal open in the dim red light. His pen trembled as he wrote down the names of the missing. Each one carved itself into his mind like a wound. The sea outside pressed against the hull, deep and unfeeling. He could still hear the surf crashing, the shouts of men left behind on the beach. Some of them might still be alive, some might be captured. He couldn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than any fear. In the narrow corridor, Captain James Roosevelt moved between the wounded. He tore bandages from what little cloth remained and checked pulses with trembling fingers. One Marine clutched a rosary, another whispered for his mother in his sleep. War had stripped them down to the barest form of humanity, pain, fatigue, and memory. The submarine's engines thrummed beneath their feet, carrying them east, back toward the safety of Pearl Harbor. Yet no one felt safe. Every man aboard knew that part of their team was missing, stranded somewhere on that infernal atoll under Japanese control. At dawn, Nautilus broke the surface to recharge. The ocean stretched endlessly, grey and indifferent. The men climbed onto the deck to breathe air that didn't taste of oil and confinement. The horizon glowed faintly where Makin burned, a smear of smoke against the morning sky. Carlson joined them, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. "We did what we came for," he said quietly, as if saying it out loud might make it true. But the doubt was written in his eyes. The raiders had inflicted heavy damage, radio stations destroyed, garrison wiped out, supplies torched. Yet the cost had been high, too high. In the days to come, that cost would grow even heavier. Back on Makin, the men who couldn't reach the boats awoke to silence and ruin. Corporal William McAllister opened his eyes to the sun searing his face and the sound of distant shouting. Around him, the jungle was littered with corpses. He and a handful of survivors had taken shelter among the mangroves during the evacuation, hoping to swim out later. Now they were trapped. The Japanese were everywhere, sweeping the island for stragglers. The air stank of rot and smoke. The lagoon shimmered with oil slicks and debris. The surviving raiders huddled in the shadows, clutching empty weapons, waiting for nightfall. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew closer. Boots crunching over coral, voices barking in Japanese, bayonets stabbing through the undergrowth. When they were found, the firefight was brief and hopeless. Outnumbered and out of ammunition, the remaining raiders were captured. Hands bound with rope, they were marched through the ruins of the outpost they had destroyed. Japanese soldiers spat curses at them, their faces twisted with fury. The prisoners saw the devastation their comrades had wrought, the smouldering wreckage, the bodies of enemy troops still being buried in shallow graves. For the Japanese, this was no longer a battle. It was vengeance. The captured Marines were taken to the Japanese headquarters at Kwajalein, hundreds of miles away. There, they disappeared into the machinery of war. Names erased, identities reduced to rumors. What happened to them would remain one of the Pacific's darker secrets until long after the war's end. Back aboard Nautilus, Carlson received the first reports from reconnaissance planes. Japanese radio traffic confirmed enemy casualties, and that the garrison at Makin had been annihilated. Strategically, the raid had been a success. Psychologically, it sent a message. The United States could strike anywhere, even deep behind enemy lines. But the loss of men haunted him. He stared at the submarine's bulkhead and whispered, "Success means nothing when your men don't come home." For days the raiders endured the claustrophobic voyage back to Hawaii. Their minds replayed the sights and sounds of battle, Thomason's fall, the screams of the wounded, the surf swallowing their comrades. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others sat in silence, eyes fixed on the metal floor, as if afraid to remember too much. When Nautilus finally reached Pearl Harbor, the men stepped onto solid ground to the cheers of naval personnel. But behind the applause was a quiet unease. The official reports glossed over the chaos, the failed extractions, the missing men. Publicly, it was hailed as a triumph. Privately, it was a wound stitched with lies. Carlson and Roosevelt were summoned to brief Admiral Nimitz. In a sterile room overlooking the harbor, they laid out maps, photographs, and casualty lists. Nimitz listened, arms crossed, his expression grave. "You've given us proof," he said. "The Japanese can be hit, and they can bleed." Then his tone softened. "But I know what it cost you." That night, Carlson walked along the shoreline alone. The lights of Honolulu flickered in the distance, reflecting on the calm water. He thought of his men, the ones who had fought, the ones who had died, and the ones who might still be trapped in enemy hands. He clenched the sand in his fist and whispered to the dark sea, "We'll remember them." Far across the Pacific, at Kwajalein, the captured raiders endured their fate. In makeshift prison huts they were interrogated, beaten, and starved. The Japanese guards demanded information, unit names, future operations. But the Marines gave nothing. For months they lived in isolation, weakened by disease and hunger. Some prayed for rescue, others simply prayed for death. Then, in October 1942, their story ended in silence. On the orders of Japanese officers, the surviving prisoners were executed, beheaded near the edge of the lagoon they had fought to conquer. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves unmarked, their identities swallowed by war. News of their deaths would not reach the United States until years later. By then the world had moved on. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima had overshadowed the early raids. But for those who knew the men, the wound never healed. In the months following the Makin Raid, the Marine raiders were reshaped and redeployed. Carlson led his unit through brutal campaigns across the Solomon Islands, where the lessons of Makin hardened them into legends. The gung-ho spirit, once an experiment in unity, became a rallying cry for every man who fought under his command. They learned to move like ghosts, strike without warning, and vanish into the jungle before the enemy could react. Yet Carlson himself was never the same. His hair turned grayer, his voice quieter. In his journal he wrote, "War does not reward courage, it only measures endurance. The men of Makin endured." By 1943, the Makin Raid had become both myth and warning within the Marine Corps. New recruits whispered about the ghost raiders who vanished into the surf, the heroes who struck first and paid the price. For every victory that followed, Makin remained the shadow in the background, the reminder that every success in war demanded blood. For the Japanese, the raid sparked a different kind of reckoning. Believing the Americans would target the Gilberts again, they fortified the islands heavily. A year later, when U.S. forces invaded Tarawa and Makin in full strength, they met the resistance Makin had helped to create. Thousands would die in the sands Carlson's raiders once crossed in darkness. The tide of war was turning, but it was turning on a current of sacrifice. The Makin Raid, once seen as a small operation, had reshaped Japanese strategy across the Pacific. Every palm tree and lagoon now hid a fortress. The price of that lesson was paid by fewer than 200 men who dared to strike first. In 1943, when the Marines finally returned to Makin, they found little but ruins. Empty trenches, broken helmets, rusted shell casings. In a shallow grave near the beach, they uncovered the remains of a few missing raiders. Their bones were reburied with honors, the sand finally closing over their story. Carlson stood among the crosses, his eyes lost to the horizon. The wind carried the scent of the same sea that had nearly swallowed them a year before. He spoke softly, more to the ghosts than the men around him. "You did not die in vain." For the first time since that burning night, he almost believed it. The Pacific was vast, but memory has no horizon. Long after the guns fell silent, the name Makin lingered in the minds of those who had survived. For Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson and his raiders, the raid had ended in smoke and salt water, a brief, violent spark in the early days of America's Island War. Yet the echoes of those 2 days in August 1942 stretched far beyond that lonely atoll. When the surviving raiders returned to Hawaii, they were met with handshakes, headlines, and medals. The newspapers called them heroes, but behind the proud words and military decorations lay a truth far more complex. Many of the men could not sleep without hearing the surf again, The sound of gunfire carried on the wind. They had left pieces of themselves on that coral shore, pieces no medal could replace. Carlson received the Navy Cross, but he accepted it with a heavy heart. Each commendation ceremony reminded him of the empty spaces where his men should have stood. He often visited the hospital wards, speaking quietly to the wounded who had returned. "We did what we could," he would tell them. "That's all war ever asks." Yet deep inside, he questioned whether it was enough. The official story framed Makin as a success, a daring commando strike that rattled the Japanese and boosted American morale. And in many ways it had. Strategically, it forced Japan to divert troops to defend islands across the Central Pacific, spreading their forces thin. The raid's psychological shock proved immense. Japan had believed its outer defenses untouchable, yet a handful of Marines had breached them. But for the raiders, the cost was personal. The nightmares did not fade. In their dreams, they still saw the faces of the captured men. Those left behind in the surf, those executed months later in secret. The guilt of survival followed them like a shadow. Some drank to silence it. Others buried themselves in new battles, hoping that the roar of combat might drown out the past. Carlson tried to find meaning in the pain. He wrote in his diary, "Makin was more than a raid. It was a lesson written in blood, and though courage and chaos walk hand in hand." When he and his raiders were redeployed to Guadalcanal in late 1942, he led them with renewed intensity. The jungles there were darker, the fighting even more savage. Yet those who had been at Makin moved with a grim determination, hardened by their ordeal. They fought not only the Japanese, but also the ghosts that trailed them from one battlefield to another. Carlson became a symbol of an ideal. The warrior who questioned authority, yet never wavered in duty. He believed leadership meant standing among the men, not above them. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, and faced the same danger they did. His philosophy, gung-ho work together, spread across the Marine Corps, reshaping the way small unit warfare was fought in the Pacific. Still, even victory could not erase Makin. By 1943, the war had grown monstrous. Battles like Tarawa, Saipan and Peleliu would dwarf the scale of the Makin Raid. Yet in every amphibious operation that followed, commanders remembered what Carlson's raiders had learned the hard way. Never underestimate the sea, never assume the enemy is broken, and never forget the men you leave behind. When American forces finally returned to Makin in November 1943, now a full-scale invasion under Operation Galvanic, the lagoon once again erupted with fire. Battleships pounded the beaches that Carlson's men had once crept across in silence. Thousands of Marines stormed ashore, met by fierce Japanese resistance. The island that had been a whisper of early war defiance now became a symbol of vengeance fulfilled. The U.S. flag was raised over Makin at last, but for the veterans of the first raid, victory tasted bittersweet. They knew the sand beneath that flag was soaked with the memory of their brothers who never left. After the battle, recovery teams began the solemn task of searching for the remains of the missing raiders. Among the shallow graves and overgrown bunkers, they uncovered the truth that had haunted Carlson for a year. The men captured at Makin had been executed by their captors. Their remains were finally brought home, laid to rest with military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. The headstones stood in perfect rows, white against the green, silent witnesses to sacrifice. Carlson attended the ceremony in silence. As the bugle sounded taps, he removed his cap and bowed his head. He felt the Pacific wind again, the same wind that had carried their last cries across the waves. The ghosts of Makin were finally home. After the war, the Marine raiders were disbanded, their legacy absorbed into the modern special forces that would come after them, the SEALs, the Green Berets, the raiders of future generations. Their tactics, their courage, their spirit would shape warfare for decades, but the men themselves faded quietly into civilian life, carrying invisible scars. James Roosevelt returned to the States, forever changed by what he had seen. Carlson, older and weary, continued to advocate for his men and for the belief that unity and equality among soldiers made them stronger. He died in 1947, just 2 years after the war's end, his health broken, but his conviction unshaken. In the years that followed, the story of the Makin Raid slipped into the shadows of history. Larger battles stole the spotlight. The world remembered Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, but few spoke of that small, desperate fight on a forgotten atoll in August 1942. And yet for those who knew, Makin was the beginning, the moment when America's war in the Pacific took its first bold step into enemy territory. Today, Makin is known as Butaritari, a quiet island of palm trees and gentle surf. Tourists walk its beaches, unaware that beneath the sand lie fragments of helmets, shell casings, and the rusted remnants of war. The sea has reclaimed much, but not everything. Sometimes, after storms, villagers still find bones washed ashore. Silent reminders of the young men who came from across the ocean to fight for people they would never meet. Standing there now, it's easy to forget the roar of battle that once tore this paradise apart. But if you listen closely, if the wind shifts just right, you can almost hear the whispers of the past, the paddles striking water, the shouts in the dark, the defiant cry of men facing impossible odds. Carlson's words, carved into the memory of his raiders, still echo. Freedom is not won by numbers, but by men who believe in something greater than themselves. The Makin Raid was not about territory or statistics. It was about message, that courage could rise even in defeat, that defiance could bloom in the darkest places. The men who landed there knew they might not return, yet they went anyway. Their story is not one of triumph alone, but of humanity, flawed, fearful, unbreakable. The Pacific War would rage on for 3 more brutal years. But long before Iwo Jima or Okinawa, before the atomic fire and surrender, the spark that lit America's march across the ocean began with those 211 raiders on a storm-tossed night. History may forget the details, but the spirit of Makin endures. In every soldier who faces the impossible, in every sacrifice made far from home. The lagoon that once ran red with blood now reflects only the sky, as if the island itself has chosen peace. Yet beneath that calm surface lies the truth of war, that victory always comes at a price, and the names of the fallen are never truly lost. This was Makin. This was where America learned that heroism is not loud, not clean, not glorious. It is the quiet endurance of men who fought, bled, and vanished into the tide, leaving behind only the echo of their courage. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.